1,000 years ago, in early September of 1024, the most powerful men of the Holy Roman Empire gathered at a place called Kamba on the Rhine. The emperor, Henry II, had died without any children, and so the assembled magnates were to choose his successor. There were two favored candidates, cousins both named Conrad. The Archbishop of Mainz, Aribo, was the first to proclaim his support for the elder cousin, and he was followed by most of the others assembled. Only a small group supported the younger Conrad, including the Archbishop of Cologne and the Dukes of Upper Lorraine, or Lotharingia, who left the assembly in frustration. The elder Conrad, now known as Conrad II, would then be crowned king in Mainz and enthroned upon the throne of Charlemagne in Aachen later that month. And a couple of years later, in 1027, he would go to Rome to be crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. If you know anything about the Holy Roman Empire, other than that infamous quote by Voltaire, it's probably that it had an elected monarchy. But chances are what you're thinking of is the late medieval and early modern elections, where you had 7 electors, and later up to 10, and where elections were fairly standardized. Or maybe you're thinking of a more modern democratic election. But neither of those really reflect Conrad II's election. At the time, the understanding of election wasn't quite the same as it later would be, nor was there a clear constitutional line between elected and hereditary monarchy. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at what elections around Conrad's time in the 11th century and before even looked like, and also get a better understanding as to why and how imperial elections even came to be. According to Voltaire, the Holy Roman Empire was not Roman. Although this may reflect the views of many people in his own day, medieval people certainly saw things otherwise. The Holy Roman Emperors were seen as the legitimate successors to the classical Roman Empire. You know, the one most people think about when you say Roman Empire. In the year 800, Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope in recognition of his aid against the Lombards of Italy, and from that point on, various successors of Charlemagne's would claim the imperial title until the empire's dissolution in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. Charlemagne's empire was divided between the heirs of his son, Louis the Pious, with the imperial title going to Louis's eldest, Lothair, who would rule Italy and the Rhineland. From that point on, the title of emperor would be closely tied to the kingdom of Italy, although there would be a period from 924 to 962 when the kings of Italy would not be crowned emperor, for reasons of complicated political conflict which I won't go into right now. In 962, however, the king of the easternmost division of Charlemagne's empire, Otto I, who had also become king of Italy as a result of said complicated political conflict, was crowned emperor by the Pope in recognition of his aid against the previous king of Italy, Berengar II, in a very clear and conscious imitation of Charlemagne. From that point on, Italy, at least northern Italy, would be ruled by Otto's successors in his German kingdom, who are also officially kings of Italy. But more importantly, these kings would also be emperors of the Romans, or Holy Roman Emperors, even once Italy would become de facto independent from the empire, which is why you get this somewhat strange situation which confuses a lot of people where what we today largely consider Germany is referred to as the Roman Empire. Now, I bring this up for a couple of reasons. First of all, to clear up any confusion for anyone who isn't as familiar with the Holy Roman Empire. And second, because the imperial election wasn't really the election of the emperor. It was the election of the German king, often given the title King of the Romans, who would be crowned emperor later on by the Pope, as was the case with Conrad II. This is the way it worked until Charles V's coronation as emperor in 1530, a decade after his election in 1519 and royal coronation in 1520. After that, there was only one coronation which conferred both titles, and the distinction stopped having any meaning. I also want to bring up a point about terminology. There wasn't really a single agreed-upon term for referring to this German kingdom in the time from Otto I to Conrad II. East Francia wasn't really used after the Ottonians, who were not Franks but Saxons, came to power. The term Regnum Teutonicum, or German kingdom, starts being used in the mid-11th century, but it wasn't all that common, and others call it by other names like Kingdom of the Eastern Franks, Saxons, Bavarians, and Alamans, reflecting the fact that a concept of a single German people hadn't really developed yet. Also common was to just refer to the Holy Roman Empire and specify north of the Alps. That said, for the sake of simplicity, I, like several other historians, am going to use the German kingdom to refer to this entity. Anyway, election in the German kingdom was only first addressed by imperial law in 1356 by
Charles IV, King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor,
who had a long and successful reign. That was in his famous Golden Bull, named after the golden seal attached to it. It was meant as a definitive law to finally make clear and codify the process of election. Amongst other things, it established the 7 electors that we all know and love: the archbishops of Cologne, Trier, and Mainz, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia. But this wasn't the invention of elected monarchy. We know of plenty of other elections before this, including Conrad II's, obviously. But the process of election had been a lot more ad hoc and customary. The first German election is often said to be that of Conrad I in 911, but the custom of election goes back even before that. It may have its origins in ancient Germanic tradition, but we really start seeing it in the selection of kings in the 9th century. The lords of West Francia, what would later become France, decided amongst themselves after Louis II's death in 879 that the kingdom should be ruled jointly by his 2 eldest teenage sons, Louis III and Charlemagne II, rather than just by the elder brother Louis. They also decided in 884, after both brothers had died, to invite Charles the Fat, that's a much later nickname by the way, to be their king. By that point, Charles was already ruling over all the other Frankish realms except Lower Burgundy, and he was the emperor. But things didn't end well for Charles. For a variety of reasons, including poor health, attempts to centralize power in a by then very divided realm, and the fact that he had no legitimate children, his support quickly fell apart and he was deposed from his various kingdoms in around 887. The most important lords of each then got together to elect a new king. West Francia elected Count Otto of Paris, who had proven himself in conflicts with the Vikings. Italy chose Berengar of Friuli, though he had lots of rivals who he had to deal with. Upper Burgundy chose Rudolf I, and East Francia and Lotharingia, i.e. the Rhineland, chose Arnulf of Carinthia, who had proven himself in wars against the Slavs and had initiated Charles's downfall when he raised an army to depose him. These events definitely legitimized election as an option throughout the Frankish kingdoms, including in West Francia, which I'll get back to later. Although election of some sort was available earlier, it's around this point that the kingdom's elites really start to feel empowered to have more of a say in the succession to the throne, especially when there was no natural, legitimate heir available. It also reflects the fact that the nobility were just generally becoming more and more powerful. Now, when I talk about election, I don't want you to think of ballot boxes and majority votes. That's not how these elections worked. These elections were not secret. People publicly proclaimed their favored candidate. This is a culture of oaths and political performance, after all. As for majority votes, and really voting at all, this would become more important later on. The Golden Bull is clear that there would be 7 electors so that there wouldn't be a draw, but not so much in the early days. Instead, early elections were more like giving assent or accepting the candidate put forward, giving approval. It was a recognition that the powerful men of the kingdom consented to being ruled by the new king. But they could also dissent, which pretty much amounted to just refusing to acknowledge him. And if enough of them did this, that candidate would just not have enough of a power base to rule, or really contest the rise of whatever alternate candidate they did accept. This is essentially what happened for Charles the Fat when he tried on several occasions to get the magnates of his kingdom to accept his illegitimate son Bernard as his successor, which they did not. In a philosophical sense, this is pretty much how every government works. But for the Franks, a custom and ideology emerged of gaining this approval explicitly at public ceremonies where this assent was expressed verbally, like the gathering at Kamba for Conrad II. Now, as you can probably imagine, not everyone's voice mattered equally. Democratic these elections were not. Instead, it was an assembly of the most powerful, generally the dukes, some more powerful counts, margraves, and other lords, the archbishops, some regular bishops, and maybe some powerful abbots. This was all with the implicit expectation that if they agreed to accept someone as king, everyone else would do so as well. The limiting of electors to a certain number comes later as counting votes becomes more of the central focus. Okay, but what if there are disagreements? If we're not counting votes, how do we decide who's the next king? Well, again, because this wasn't set into law, there wasn't really a set way to resolve this. As the historian Peter Wilson notes, unanimity in the election of a candidate was the expectation, at least ideally and outwardly. Candidates could often negotiate terms for support before the actual election, or even afterward. Because election was more just public assent to a candidate put forward to the throne, dissenters could just not show up or leave without assenting. As you might remember from the beginning, even Conrad II's opponents decided to leave when they saw that he was clearly the favorite. In that case, the new king might need to negotiate with them in exchange for assent and recognition after the fact, as both Henry II and Conrad II did with the Saxons, who actually had separate councils proclaiming them king after they promised to respect Saxon law and custom. In many cases, the dissenters were probably willing to accept the favored candidate in the end, but they may have symbolically not shown up so that they could make it clear to the king that they would have to be appeased in order to support him and not cause him trouble. Or in some cases, the favored candidate might just not invite those he knew wouldn't support him in order to give the impression of unanimous proclamation, after which point he would meet with the others to obtain homage, having already been crowned king. In either case, this could also lead to war, initiated either by the dissenters or the new king. Henry II, for example, used force to gain the acceptance of the Duke of Swabia, who had also been a contender for the throne. Many of these wars ended with the dissenters ultimately accepting the king's rule, but success in war could put the dissenters into a better position for negotiating terms for that acceptance. For example, when Henry I was elected as German king in 919, the Duke of Bavaria, Arnulf II, who had been in conflict with Henry's predecessor, doesn't seem to have been present, and he was instead elected as king by the Bavarians, either as a rival to Henry or a statement that Bavaria would be its own kingdom. Henry would ultimately defeat Arnulf, who would acknowledge Henry as his king and give up any royal pretense, but in exchange, Arnulf was given a great deal of autonomy, and several privileges over Bavaria which let him keep many of the powers of a king, with Henry essentially being his nominal liege. This kind of war was also common in Italy early on, since election was generally limited to the lords of the German kingdom, which might sometimes include Slavic lords like the Duke of Poland, and kingship over Italy was automatically conferred upon the German kings after Otto I. There were a few exceptions to this when assent by the Italians was actively sought. Most famously, Otto III was accepted as German and Italian king in Verona, which is in Italy, in 983, in an assembly which included lords from both realms. But generally speaking, this was the exception, though the chronicler Wipo of Burgundy says that they weren't at Conrad II's election simply because they couldn't get there on such short notice. And after Conrad II's campaign into Italy in 1026 to 1027, where he forced his opponents to submit before his imperial coronation in Rome, there weren't really any attempts to deny the Italian crown to the German kings. That isn't to say that there would be no more conflicts between Holy Roman Emperors and the Italians, but these would be more about ownership of specific lands and the nature of the emperor's authority in Italy. As for what was looked for in a potential candidate, there were a variety of factors to consider. Generally, you wanted your king to be physically capable, so those horrendously maimed from battle or torture tended not to be considered. There was also often an emphasis on sound moral character and virtue. One reason for the selection of Lothair of Supplingburg over Frederick II of Swabia in the election of 1125 was supposedly Lothair's humility as opposed to Frederick's arrogance. Prestige was also an important factor, especially for deeds which demonstrated that the candidate would make a good king. Hence, Otto's success in defending Paris from Vikings leading to his election as king of West Francia in 888. Other factors could be more political and calculated. The early medieval world, like the later, was a world of complex interpersonal relations which were very much at play in elections as well, and oaths and bonds of loyalty, marriage ties, and blood relations were all considered. And as I noted earlier, support could be gained through agreements and negotiations. Of course, having a big army could also win you support, though you usually had to have lots of support in the first place to end up with a big army, which is why you tended to have wars after elections to get those who hadn't yet done so to assent, once you already had a guarantee of a strong backing. But one of the most influential factors in deciding a new candidate was designation of a successor by the previous ruler. This is where the idea of election gets really stretched to its limits, and where, in many cases, the election is really just the lords of the land giving their approval of the king's choice. This was especially the case when the king designated his own son. When there was a change of dynasty, like when Conrad I chose Henry I as his successor in 919, there could be more dissent. But when it comes to direct father-to-son inheritance, it's hard to really speak of an election. Otto I, Henry I's son, was unilaterally accepted by the great lords of the realm, although he did have to face a rebellion by his younger brother. Otto II was then similarly accepted. In fact, Otto II was formally accepted when he was only 6 years old, before any of the other typical factors influencing elections could play much of a part, other than deals and loyalty to his father. And Otto II would have his son, Otto III, proclaimed king when he was only 3. The strength of this commitment can be seen in the fact that Otto II died only 6 months later, leaving his son as sole king. A relative of his, Henry the Quarrelsome, tried to gain support to challenge the boy, but he only ever gained a small following, which was in turn whittled down by the political maneuvering of Otto's mother, the Byzantine princess Theophanu, and the Archbishop of Mainz. Another direct line of fathers and sons was started by Conrad II, which would last until the death of Henry V in 1125, marking 101 years of rule by his house, the Salians. Now, this probably doesn't sound much like an elected monarchy anymore, does it? But again, we have to consider the election as fundamentally a process of ascent. Lineage was important to the lords of the realm, as was stable succession. So, to quote from the historian Bernd Kannowski, if the German throne was in the hands of a strong family of rulers with competent male heirs, the prince's right to election could take a back seat and reduce to become a mere formality. But the less clear a succession was, the more significance the electing princes gained. They were particularly important when dynasties changed through lack of male heirs. If the king was weak and incompetent in the elector's eyes, they could, in theory, even depose him. That last bit's especially true in the election of anti-kings like Rudolf of Rheinfelden, elected in 1077 in opposition to Henry IV during the investiture controversy. Interestingly, he was elected under the promise that future elections would be free, as in he wouldn't designate a successor. But Henry IV ultimately prevailed, and dynastic tendencies would continue throughout the empire's history. Although there was a long period of time between 1257 and 1486 where heredity was less considered and there was only one instance of succession from father to son, that being from
Charles IV
to Wenceslaus IV, the Habsburgs would famously rule after that point as a mostly unbroken chain of fathers and sons, and occasionally brothers, for the last several centuries of the empire's life, with a couple of exceptions. The only reason that election continued to exist in the Holy Roman Empire is because these chains were broken up enough times in the early years, which led to actual more significant elections, that an ideology of election was firmly established into the custom of succession in the German kingdom. On the other hand, we don't think of France, West Francia, as an elected monarchy, despite the fact that they also had elections, because these elections didn't set as firm of a precedent. I've mentioned Otto of Paris several times, but his brother, Robert I, would also be elected, and eventually so would Robert's grandson, Hugh Capet, in 986. But Hugh Capet took inspiration from his German neighbors and had his son, Robert II, assented to by the lords of France and crowned as co-king the following year in 987. And Robert II would do the same with his son, the future Henry I, and this practice continued until the coronation of Philip Augustus, Philip II, in 1179, the last Capetian king to be crowned in his father's lifetime. Because this line went uninterrupted for 200 years by that point, the ideal of election never took hold the same way it would in the Holy Roman Empire, and instead, the ideal of hereditary succession by the eldest son became the French custom, the expectation. But back to the German kingdom. The term election can be misleading if we imagine the kind of elections that we're used to today. But the word election, or more accurately the Latin term electio from which it originates, just means a choosing or a selection. If we look at it like this, the powerful magnates of the Holy Roman Empire did elect their king and emperor. Conrad II was elected, as were the Ottos, though their elections played out a little differently. In the early days of the German kingdom, what was important was that the lords of the realm got to publicly agree to whoever would be king, and when there wasn't as clear and natural of a successor, they had a few more options as to who they would agree to. And it was this form of election which would gradually evolve over time into the more familiar electoral system which we later see for choosing the Holy Roman Emperor, one with a defined set of electors and where a majority vote was needed. Once medieval society as a whole would develop a more legalistic and abstract understanding of the state and politics in general. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.